August 23rd, 1968. 0105 hours. WWII DG Camp, Central Highlands, South Vietnam. The NVA 6th Regiment is inside the wire. The operations center is burning. Every building around it is burning. The sky over the Central Highlands glows a deep and terrible orange, and that color is not the color of sunrise. It is the color of a fight that has already gone wrong in every direction, and the men on the ground know it. 40 defenders are locked inside a concrete blockhouse below the inferno. They are Special Forces advisors and South Vietnamese troops who have been fighting since nightfall. The perimeter they were assigned to hold has collapsed. They are surrounded on 3 sides. Their ammunition is almost gone. There is no relief column on the way. There is no cavalry. There is only the darkness outside the walls and the sound of men who will not stop coming. Every radio in that camp is transmitting distress on every frequency available. The voices going out into the night are precise, professional, controlled in the way that men under training learn to control their voices even when the situation has moved past the point that training accounted for. And the silence coming back on the other end of those transmissions is the most dangerous sound of all. Then, one of the men inside the blockhouse hears something. Not a jet. There is no high, thin scream of a phantom cutting through the sky. No thunder of afterburners lighting up the dark 2 counties away before the aircraft arrives overhead. None of the sounds that a soldier in Vietnam learns to love, because they mean someone up there is fast and armed and coming for the people who are coming for you. This is something different. Something that does not belong to 1968 at all. The low, heavy, unmistakable drone of twin radial engines turning slowly somewhere above the smoke. The sound of a machine designed in the 1930s. Circling. And then the second sound arrives. It is not gunfire. A man who has been in combat knows what gunfire sounds like. He knows the crack of a single rifle, the stutter of a machine gun. The way automatic fire has a rhythm to it, spaces between the bursts where a breath might theoretically fit. This is not that. This is continuous. A roar that does not stop, does not pause, does not breathe. Like an enormous saw tearing through steel at full speed, and never for even a fraction of a second slowing. Every 5th round glows red. And from where the men in the blockhouse are standing, those tracer rounds do not look like bullets. They look like a river of fire bending out of the darkness above, curving down through the smoke, touching the earth in a place where men had been standing moments before. Continuous, unwavering, the jungle floor erupts below it. The attack stops. The enemy had a name for what was circling above them in that darkness. They had not received the name from a briefing. They had not found it in a manual. They had arrived at it themselves from direct experience from watching what the thing overhead did to a battlefield at night when the people below had nowhere to run. They called it the Dragon. But here is what almost no one in that burning camp knew that night. And what very few Americans know today, more than half a century later, when the wars of that era have faded from living memory into history. The weapon circling above Duke Lap in August of 1968 had been rejected by the United States military 3 times. Over 40 years. 3 separate branches of the American Armed Forces had examined the underlying concept, declared that it had no tactical application, and returned to their other priorities. The man who refused to accept those rejections had funded its critical early test using his personal American Express card, because the official budget had not materialized, and he had calculated that the cost of waiting was being paid in lives. And when he finally arrived in Vietnam with proof that the concept was sound, armed military police met him on the tarmac with written orders to put him and his equipment on the next available flight back to the United States. The Dragon nearly died before it ever flew. This is the story of how it survived, and of the 2 men at the center of that survival. One was a fighter pilot from Ohio who had watched a Hamlet fall from 3,000 feet and decided that the mathematics of that moment were wrong and that he was going to fix them whether the Air Force wanted him to or not. The other was a 23-year-old loadmaster from Hartford, Connecticut, who would volunteer for a flight that was not his assignment, and on that flight do something that no training manual had ever prepared anyone for. To understand why those 2 men matter, you have to understand the world they were operating in. You have to understand what the night in Vietnam actually was in 1964. By 1964, American air power was the most capable fighting force in the history of flight. Under daylight conditions and favorable weather against targets, it could locate and identify. There was no air arm on Earth that could match what the United States brought to a battlefield. The A-1 Sky Raider was a propeller-driven attack aircraft that could carry a bomb load heavier than most of the heavies from World War II, and place it with a precision that would have seemed impossible to the pilots of that earlier conflict. The F-100 Super Sabre flew near the speed of sound. The F-4 Phantom was a weapon system so overwhelming in its original design that the engineers who built it genuinely believed a gun was no longer necessary. These were machines of remarkable violence designed and built at the absolute peak of American industrial and engineering capability, flown by men who were among the most skilled aviators on the planet. Every one of them shared a fatal limitation. They could not stay. A fighter aircraft arrives over a target, completes one attack pass, perhaps two, and then the fuel state forces it home. The total time that aircraft is actually over the battlefield, actually engaging the enemy, is measured in minutes, sometimes in seconds. There are no exceptions to this arithmetic. It is built into the physics of a machine that burns thousands of pounds of fuel per hour at combat power. You get there fast. You hit hard. Then you leave. The sky is empty again. The Viet Cong understood this equation with the clarity that comes from staking your life on understanding it correctly every time. The strategy they built from that understanding was elegant in its brutality. Attack at night. The Special Forces camps scattered through the Central Highlands and the Mekong Delta were isolated, lightly garrisoned, and separated from each other by miles of hostile jungle. They were small dots of American military presence in a vast and largely indifferent darkness. Hit them after midnight when the defenders were working through their deepest fatigue, when the response time of any air support was at its longest, when the darkness itself was the most reliable and most democratic weapon available to either side. The jets could not track what they could not see. When they arrived, a disciplined force could hear them coming and go still. Scatter into the trees. Wait for the aircraft to expend its ordnance and turn for home. Then resume. Wait out the jet. Resume the attack. This was not a philosophy. It was a tactic that had been tested against reality and had passed. Throughout 1963 and into the early months of 1964, outposts and hamlets across South Vietnam were falling to coordinated night attacks by Viet Cong forces, who had made darkness into both their armor and their weapon. The pattern was consistent enough that American commanders knew it was a pattern. Knowing it was a pattern and being able to break it were two different things. The Air Force had developed a partial answer. C-47 and C-123 transport aircraft were converted into what were called flare ships, outfitted to carry and deploy magnesium illumination rounds, each generating 2 million candle power when it opened on its parachute. Drop enough of them over a position under attack and the darkness becomes irrelevant. The defenders can see the tree line. They can see the assault formations massing outside the wire. They can see exactly how many are coming and from which direction and how much time is left before the breach. The flare ships gave the defenders vision. They gave them nothing else. Because the flare ship carried no weapons. It could illuminate the killing ground. It could not do the killing. The Viet Cong adapted within weeks of the flare ships appearing over the battlefield. When the flares ignited overhead, the attacking force stopped. They laid down in whatever cover existed. They watched the parachutes drift in whatever wind was present and burn out one by one. When the C-47 exhausted its load and turned toward its home base, the darkness returned on schedule. The attack resumed. The voices on the defenders' radios got quieter. Night after night, the same equation, the same result. The light arrived and the killing ground became visible, and there was nothing that could be done with the visibility except watch it resolve into defeat. The men flying the flare ships understood exactly what they were part of. They could see it from 3,000 feet with perfect clarity. Through the cargo door, the world below was lit up in cold white light, and what the light showed was a fight that needed more than illumination. The radio traffic told the rest of the story. Voices asking for fire support, asking for anything that could stay overhead and fight. And the only aircraft close enough to matter was the one they were already in, and it was armed with magnesium candles. One of those men came home from Vietnam in the summer of 1964 with the question that he could not find an acceptable answer to, no matter how long he thought about it. Captain Ronald W. Terry was not a researcher or a theorist. He was a fighter pilot. FF-86 Sabres, F-100 Super Sabres, the fast jets of the late 1950s and early 1960s. He understood air power in the most direct terms. The profession offers, you find the target, you deliver the weapons, you go home and you figure out what to do better next time. In early 1964, the Air Force assigned him to Vietnam as part of an Air Force Systems Command team reviewing every aspect of American air operations in the counterinsurgency war. He did not fly combat missions on that deployment. His job was to observe, to evaluate, to carry what he learned back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio and translate it into something useful for the institution. He spent weeks flying observer missions on flare ships, C-47s and C-123s circling over positions under attack in the dark, dropping their loads of magnesium light, and Terry sat in the observer's seat and watched through the cargo door as the scene below played out in the cold, flat illumination of those 2 million candle power rounds. One night, a hamlet came under assault. The flare ship arrived. The flares dropped. The darkness below became a scene that Terry could read with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his career studying what weapons do to terrain and to people. He could see individual figures in the tree line. He could see the muzzle flashes marking at least 3 separate firing positions. He could see the wire around the hamlet perimeter, and he could measure with his eye how close the assault formation had already come to it. He could see exactly what was about to happen. The aircraft he was sitting in had no way to alter any of it. The flares burned out one by one. The C-47 turned toward home. The hamlet fell. Terry returned to Wright-Patterson in the summer of 1964. He brought with him a question that would not leave him alone, regardless of what else he turned his attention to. He described it afterward in language deliberately stripped of drama, the way a man describes a thing he has thought about so many times that he has moved past the need to make it sound significant. What if the light could shoot back at Wright-Patterson? Terry did what any thorough officer does when confronted with a problem that his own experience has not equipped him to solve. He went through the files. He read the old reports. He was looking for any prior work on nighttime close air support, any prior attempt to address the problem of an aircraft that could not only illuminate a battlefield, but stay over it and fight on it. He found Project Tailchaser in a filing cabinet. It was not prominently stored. It was not marked as urgent or as current. It was a collection of test reports and evaluation documents from a series of experiments conducted by Captain John C. Simons, a researcher at Wright-Patterson, who had spent 3 years trying to convince a skeptical institution to look seriously at a concept the military had already turned down twice in the preceding 40 years. Terry read every page. Then he went and found Simons and flew with him. And within days of first opening that filing cabinet, Terry had understood something that every previous review of the concept had missed, not because the reviewers were wrong about the physics, but because none of them had recently watched a hamlet fall from 3,000 feet for want of exactly this thing. The idea in those files was right. It had always been right. The question was whether anyone was willing to fight for it. The idea behind Project Tailchaser was almost embarrassingly simple. Simple enough that its simplicity may have been part of why serious military minds kept setting it aside. Mount a gun on the left side of an aircraft. Fly that aircraft in a continuous left-hand banking turn. The gun stays aimed at a fixed point on the ground for as long as the turn is maintained. The aircraft orbits the target. The gun fires without interruption. The target receives continuous fire from a weapon that never has to break off the attack and reposition. It simply circles and keeps firing for as long as the pilot holds the turn and the ammunition holds out. That is the entire concept. It is a geometric observation, a consequence of physics. Nothing about it is mysterious or complex, and 3 separate branches of the American military had refused to act on it. Each refusal arriving at a different decade for different stated reasons from different institutional voices, and each refusal wrong in exactly the same way. 1926. First Lieutenant Fred Nelson, Kelly Field, Texas. He mounted a .30 caliber machine gun on a DH-4 biplane and flew it in a continuous left banking turn over a ground target. The geometry worked exactly as the physics predicted it would. He held the target in his sights for as long as he maintained the turn. Army brass watched the test. They saw it work. They acknowledged it worked. Then they returned to their offices. No tactical application. 1942. Lieutenant Gilmore C. McDonald. He developed a detailed proposal for side-firing weapons mounted on patrol aircraft intended for use in anti-submarine operations over the open ocean. He wrote it up, carefully documented the physics, submitted the proposal through the appropriate channels. The Navy did not respond. 1961. McDonald, now retired, was at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida when he found himself in conversation with Ralph E. Flexman of Bell Aerosystems. Flexman listened to what McDonald was describing and identified something that the previous two rejections had overlooked. The concept had been rejected twice, but it had never been tested to failure. Every dismissal was built on institutional inertia and budget preference, not on evidence that the underlying physics were flawed. The physics had never been shown to be wrong. They had simply been ignored in favor of other approaches. Flexman brought the concept to Captain John C. Simons at Wright-Patterson. Simons was a methodical man who understood precisely what kind of resistance he was going to face and designed his test accordingly. He asked for no weapons, no live fire, nothing that would allow skeptics to dismiss the effort as impractical before the data was in. He asked only for the chance to prove the geometry. The test was called Project Tail Chaser. It used cameras instead of guns. Simons had cameras mounted on a C-131B cargo aircraft and drew crosshairs on the cockpit windows with grease pencil. He flew pylon turns over a target range, while the cameras recorded everything the crosshairs were aimed at for the duration of each maneuver. When the film came back from processing, the result was unambiguous. At 30 degrees of bank at 120 knots airspeed, the left side of the aircraft stayed aimed at a single fixed point on the ground for the complete duration of the turn. Not approximately aimed. Not aimed with tolerances that required sophisticated correction systems. Aimed precisely, consistently, continuously. The physics that Fred Nelson had demonstrated on a biplane in Texas in 1926 were still true in 1961. They had always been true. They would always be true because they were not a matter of opinion or doctrine. They were geometry. Simons had his proof. The film proved it. The math proved it. Then the budget ran out. The personnel were reassigned. Project Tail Chaser went into a box, and the box went into a filing cabinet, and 3 years passed while men in Vietnam died at night because an aircraft that could stay overhead and fight had not yet been built. Then Ronald Terry came home from Vietnam, walked into the flight test division, and started going through the files. Terry did not have the luxury of waiting for the budget process to align itself with the urgency he felt. The bureaucracy that governed defense spending moved at the pace. Bureaucracies move, which is the pace of institutional comfort, not the pace of a battlefield where the arithmetic was being settled every night in Vietnamese hamlets. He made a calculation that most officers would not have made. He decided that the cost of waiting would be paid in lives that did not have to be lost, and that this was an unacceptable transaction. He reached into his wallet. The early weapons tests for what would become the AC-47 Spooky were funded in part by Ronald Terry's personal American Express card. This is not a figure of speech or a rhetorical flourish designed to add color to the story. This is a documented historical fact. A captain in the United States Air Force paid out of his own pocket to advance a weapons program that his institution had declined to formally fund because he had watched a hamlet fall from 3,000 feet, and he had decided that was not an acceptable outcome, and he was going to change it regardless of what the budget said. Working with Captain Simons and the small team that had sustained Tail Chaser through its years of near dormancy, Terry pushed the program into live fire testing. The weapon they chose for the aircraft was the General Electric SUU-11A minigun pod. 6 rotating barrels, electrically driven, capable of 6,000 rounds per minute at maximum firing rate. What made the minigun specifically suited to this application was a quality that aircraft gunners had long wished existed in their weapons. It was indifferent to imperfect ammunition. A conventional gas-operated machine gun depended on each individual cartridge firing to cycle the action. One misfire meant a jam. A jam in the middle of a night defense mission over a camp that was going to be overrun without sustained fire was not a mechanical inconvenience. It was a death sentence for the men below. The minigun's electric motor continued rotating regardless of what any individual cartridge did. A dud round was simply extracted by the ongoing rotation ejected out of the weapon system and replaced by the next live round. The gun kept firing. That was the only requirement: keep firing. By late summer of 1964, Terry and his team were at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, conducting live fire tests. 3 miniguns mounted in a modified C-47 cargo aircraft. 2 guns firing through the rear window openings, 1 firing through the open cargo door. all three on the left side of the aircraft. Terry flew pylon turns and the guns fired. Nothing in the test reports had prepared anyone present for what it actually sounded like from inside the aircraft. At 6,000 rounds per minute per gun, 3 guns together produced 18,000 rounds per minute, 300 rounds per second leaving the aircraft. At that rate, the gap between individual shots ceased to exist as a perceptible thing. There was no rhythm, no stutter, no way for a human ear to separate what it was hearing into discrete events. The sound was simply continuous. An unbroken roar accompanied by fire erupting from all 3 gun ports and spent brass pouring across the cargo floor in a copper flood that built and built against the rear bulkhead. From the ground at the target range, the tracers produced an effect that no one present had ever seen from an aircraft before. Every 5th round was a tracer. At 18,000 rounds per minute, that meant 3,600 tracer rounds per minute reaching the ground. Not flickering, not flashing like individual shots. Arriving in a continuous stream of red light connecting the aircraft to the earth, bending as the bank angle shifted, touching the target in an unbroken burn. And that river of visible red light, as dramatic as it was, represented only 20% of what was actually falling on the target below. The other 80% was invisible. A 3-second burst from all 3 guns together covered a 52-yard ellipse on the ground. 1 round landing every 2.4 yards across that entire area. Put it in terms that a man standing on the ground can picture, take a standard American football field and imagine putting 1 bullet in every single square yard of it. That is what 3 seconds of spooky fire did to a target. In 3 seconds. November 1964. Terry and Captain Simons traveled to Washington to brief General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff. The room also contained multiple 3-star generals who had opposed the program and who had been vocal about their opposition through channels that had preceded Terry's arrival. The institutional arguments against the AC-47 concept were not all without merit. There were officers who genuinely believed and could make a reasonable case for the belief that a slow cargo plane flying low over a contested battlefield at night was simply going to become a new category of aircraft loss. The aircraft had no armor. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. A direct hit from any serious ground fire was going to mean fire, and fire in an aircraft loaded with ammunition and magnesium flares had a predictable outcome. But underneath that tactical argument, there was a second argument that had nothing to do with aircraft survivability. The Air Force had been in a long institutional competition with the Army over who controlled close air support. The Air Force position held firmly and defended expensively for years was that fixed-wing aircraft rather than Army helicopters were the appropriate means of supporting ground troops from the air. If the Air Force now endorsed the concept of arming its own cargo planes for a fire support role, the argument against the Army arming its helicopters for the same purpose became significantly harder to make. The budget implications were not small. Men were dying at night in Vietnamese hamlets, while generals in Washington calculated what those deaths meant for the defense appropriations process. LeMay listened to the full briefing without interruption. He watched the test footage from Eglin, the river of tracer fire bending down from the circling aircraft, the target area erupting, the measured results from the range cards. He saw what the guns did. He saw the problem they had been built to solve. Then he spoke. Take them to Vietnam and try it out. 4 words. 40 years of 3 separate rejections. 4 words to end them. The generals in the room who had opposed the program did not stop opposing it. The opposition would follow Terry to Vietnam and meet him on the runway before he could even begin his first test. But for the moment, the most senior officer in the United States Air Force had looked at what Ronald Terry had built and what Ronald Terry had paid for himself and had decided that it was worth trying. The Dragon had authorization. It had a destination. Whether it would actually be allowed to land at that destination was a question that had not yet been answered. December 2nd, 1964. Bien Hoa Air Base, South Vietnam. Captain Ronald W. Terry stepped off the aircraft onto Vietnamese soil, carrying the personal authorization of the Air Force Chief of Staff, the validated proof of concept from the Eglin tests and equipment, to modify 2 C-47 cargo planes into something that had never been officially deployed in combat before. He had been fighting to get to this moment for months. He had funded the early stages of the program from his own pocket. He had sat in a room with Curtis LeMay and made his case and received 4 words in return that he understood to mean, go. Armed air police were waiting on the tarmac. The orders they carried were written, and they were specific. Terry was not welcome. His equipment was not welcome. His program was not welcome. The institutional opposition that had been vocal in Washington had moved faster than his aircraft and had arrived in Vietnam before him. The local command at Bien Hoa had received the opposition's message, absorbed it, and translated it into an action: send him home. Hold that image for a moment. A decorated fighter pilot, authorized by the most senior officer in his branch of service, carrying proof that his weapon could save American lives at night, being physically stopped at the gate by men from his own military holding, written orders to turn him around. The opposition was not finished with arguments or memos. It had acquired bodies with weapons and instructions. General John McConnell, Vice Chief of Staff, overrode the order from Washington. Terry was permitted to proceed. He selected 2 C-47s from the 1st Air Commando Squadron, examined the maintenance logs, and chose aircraft with relatively low flight time. The modifications began immediately. Miniguns into the cargo door opening. Miniguns into the rear window positions. A borrowed gun sight from an A-1 Sky Raider mounted in the cockpit window. A trigger button wired to the pilot's control wheel so that all 3 guns could be fired individually or simultaneously from the left seat. The first aircraft, serial number 43-48579, was ready by December 11th, the second by December 15th. Consider those numbers. The airframe designated 43-48579 had been built in 1943. It was 21 years old. Its design traced back to the early 1930s. Its first flight had occurred on December 17, 1935, 32 years after the Wright brothers lifted off at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Most of the men who would fly it in 1964 were younger than the aircraft itself. A machine designed when Franklin Roosevelt was beginning his first term in office was about to become the most feared close air support platform in a war being fought in the age of supersonic interceptors and guided missiles. The Air Force that had tried to send it home from the runway had no idea what it had almost turned away. Terry's aiming method for those first combat tests was improvised in a way that would have made any weapons systems engineer deeply uncomfortable. There was no targeting computer, no laser rangefinder, no display system feeding data to the pilot from a sensor suite. Terry held the target between the left propeller hub and the top of the engine cowl and used a borrowed gun sight and the same Kentucky windage that a rifleman from 2 centuries earlier would have recognized. The geometry Captain Simons had spent 3 years proving in the tail chaser tests did the rest of the work. Fly the turn, hold the bank angle, keep the target in the sight picture. The physics do what the physics always do. December 15th. The first daylight combat test. The guns worked exactly as the specifications said they would. The pylon turn held the target in the weapon's cone for the full duration of the engagement. The tracer stream bent down from the banking aircraft in a continuous curve. The target area received fire at a density no previous aircraft had ever delivered from a sustained orbit position. Daylight was useful. Daylight was not what this weapon existed for. December 23rd, 1964. Night. The real test. Tran Yen, Mekong Delta, South Vietnam. A Special Forces outpost came under assault after dark. The defenders put out a distress call at 23:45 hours. The FC-47, still carrying the fighter cargo designation that the fighter pilot community had not yet succeeded in forcing the Air Force to abandon, arrived over the position 37 minutes after the first call. The crew deployed flares. The darkness below became the flat white of 2 million candle power illumination. The attack formation was visible. The targets were identifiable. The crew acquired them and opened fire for the first time in combat at night. One of the crew members described the first moment in words that have been quoted in every serious history of the AC-47 program ever written, because the technical specifications could not have prepared him for what he actually experienced. We opened fire, and it scared me half to death. I thought the guns had blown up. Flames not only came out of the muzzles, but blew back inside. From the ground below, from the defenders who had been fighting since nightfall and had begun the internal arithmetic of a besieged position, calculating its own odds. The view was unlike anything that had come from an aircraft over a battlefield before. Not a pass, not a bomb run, not the brief scream of a jet arriving, delivering, and departing. A river of red light descending continuously from the sky above, bending out of the darkness, touching the earth, and staying there. The roar arrived before the visual did, and then the tracer stream connected the aircraft to the ground below it, and the area where the attack formation had been organizing was simply no longer the same area. The assault on Trung Yen broke 4,500 rounds, 17 flares. One outpost held. The same night, a second distress call came from Trung Hung, 20 miles to the northeast. A second assault in progress. A second set of defenders working through the same arithmetic the first group had been calculating 30 minutes earlier. The FC-47 diverted, arrived, and opened fire again. The second attack collapsed. Combined ammunition expenditure for both engagements, 9,000 rounds. 2 outposts, no American soldiers killed. Total elapsed time from the first distress call to the end of the second engagement, less than 2 hours. The concept that 3 separate branches of the American military had rejected across 4 decades had just spent its first night in combat and had performed without variation exactly as the man who paid for its tests with his own credit card had promised it would. Between December 15th and December 26th, 1964, the FC-47 flew 16 combat sorties. All 16 were successful. Nearly 180,000 rounds fired in 11 days. The nightly pattern was the same. Each time the outpost called the aircraft arrived, the guns fired, the attack stopped. Not sometimes. Not most of the time. Every time. February 8th, 1965. Binh Dinh Province, Central Vietnam. A single FC-47 orbited over a Viet Cong hilltop position for more than 4 consecutive hours. It fired 20,500 rounds into fortified fighting positions on that hill. 1 aircraft, 1 crew, 1 night. When ground forces moved through the position the following morning, they counted what remained. Approximately 300 enemy dead. Some reports placed the confirmed figure at 100 verified kills, with additional bodies removed during the night, as Viet Cong units routinely attempted to deny accurate American assessments of their losses. Accounting for what had been carried away, the total was between 250 and 350 men who had been operational when the Dragon arrived and were not operational afterward. General Joseph Moore, the senior Air Force commander of air operations in Vietnam, reviewed the after-action report from Bong Son and submitted his request without delay. He did not ask for an expanded evaluation period. He did not request additional study. He wanted a full operational squadron of AC-47 gunships crews, trained aircraft modified, positioned in Vietnam, and available to fly every night over every position that needed them. The institutional argument against the concept was not dead. It would not die for years, but it had just been presented with data that made it significantly harder to make in a room where operational commanders were present and could read the numbers themselves. And the designation changed. The fighter pilot community had been objecting since the first FC-47 flew that a cargo aircraft had no legitimate claim to the F designation. In their professional culture, fighters were flown by fighter pilots, and the category did not extend to a 30-year-old twin-engine transport that had spent most of its working life carrying mail and cargo. The Air Force accommodated the objection. The FC-47 became the AC-47. Attack cargo. The men who had opposed the program most fiercely could not even allow it to keep the name it had been given. And the aircraft, carrying whatever letters the institution chose to put on its registration documents, continued doing what it had done from the first night at Tran Yen. It circled. The guns fired. The attacks stopped. By mid-1966, the Viet Cong had been living with the Dragon long enough to have developed a detailed and accurate institutional understanding of what it was and what it could do to their operations. The Americans who flew it called it Spooky, the radio call sign adopted by the 4th Air Commando Squadron when it deployed to Tan Son Nhut Air Base in November 1965. The South Vietnamese troops on the ground called it Puff the Magic Dragon, borrowing from the Peter, Paul, and Mary song that had been on American radio in 1963 before the aircraft flew its first combat mission. The name suited the visual something from the soft world of American popular culture attached to an instrument of violence so dramatic in its nighttime display that soldiers who saw it once described it in the same terms for the rest of their lives. The Viet Cong arrived at their name without any input from the other side. They called it the Dragon, and they wrote orders about it. Not slogans, not morale documents, operational standing orders of the kind a military commander issues when something has so fundamentally altered the conditions of the battlefield that behavior must be formally modified to account for it. Captured Viet Cong documents recovered beginning in 1966 contained a directive so clear in its language that the translation required no interpretation. Do not fire at the AC-47. The reasoning embedded in those orders was coldly rational and had nothing to do with superstition. At 3,000 feet altitude, small arms fire from rifles and light machine guns was largely ineffective against the aircraft. Achieving the angle and the sustained accurate fire necessary to bring down an aircraft at that altitude and at 120 knots airspeed with weapons designed for ground targets required conditions that were rarely present during a night assault. Shooting at the Dragon used ammunition that could not be replaced easily, revealed the firing position to a platform specifically designed to deliver continuous precision fire onto revealed positions, and invited an immediate response from an aircraft carrying 24,000 rounds and capable of maintaining the engagement for 5 to 7 hours. The calculation was negative every time it was completed. Shoot at the Dragon and you waste your ammunition, expose your position, and make it angry. The math had only one rational conclusion. Hide. Wait. Hope it runs out of ammunition before it finds you. Some of the captured orders carried language that revealed something beyond tactical calculation. Something about how the Dragon had settled into the psychology of the men who faced it in the dark, who had built their entire operational identity around the ownership of that darkness, and now found themselves being hunted through it by something that never had to land and never seemed to run out of patience. Do not attack the Dragon. Our weapons are useless against it. You will only make it angry. Read that phrase again and hold it in place long enough to understand what it represents. A military force that had built its entire strategic framework around the ownership of darkness, that had used the night as both armor and weapon against the most powerful military on Earth for years, was issuing written orders telling its own soldiers that their weapons were useless against a specific threat. Not disadvantaged, not requiring better positioning or additional support. Useless. The people who had opposed the AC-47 program in Washington argued that arming cargo aircraft was tactically unsound, institutionally inappropriate, and likely to produce nothing but a new category of aircraft losses without corresponding benefit. The enemy that program was designed to stop had arrived at a different conclusion and had committed it to paper. July 15, 1966. Phong Dinh Province. A Viet Cong force attacked a Republic of Vietnam outpost after dark. Before the assault went in, a loudspeaker broadcast a message to the defenders inside the wire. We are not afraid of your firepower. 4 AC-47s responded simultaneously. 48,800 rounds before 2 F-100s, Super Sabres arrived with napalm to complete the engagement. The attack did not resume. The loudspeaker did not broadcast again. The Vietnamese Air Force 817th Combat Squadron adopted the Dragon designation officially. The Republic of Korea forces in Vietnam requested spooky support for their operational areas. Ground commanders from multiple allied nations began specifying AC-47 coverage as a condition of holding certain positions overnight. The legend that had started on a runway where armed police waited to send the program home had become a capability that commanders planned their operations around. Any account that told only the story of what the Dragon could do would be incomplete. The AC-47 program also had a ledger that ran in the other direction, and the men who flew it knew it better than anyone writing about it afterward. The aircraft was slow. Maximum speed of 229 miles per hour. Attack airspeed of 120 knots. It flew at 3,000 feet above ground level because that altitude was required to keep the tracer rounds burning long enough to be visible on the way down and to maintain the accuracy of the fire pattern. 3,000 feet was also well within the effective range of heavy machine guns, recoilless rifles, and anti-aircraft guns that weighed less than the vehicles carrying them. The aircraft had no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no electronic countermeasures, no warning system for incoming fire beyond the eyes and ears of the men inside it. A direct hit from any serious ground weapon could start a fire in an aircraft carrying 24,000 rounds of live ammunition and 45 magnesium flares that burned at 4,000 degrees. The physics of that scenario did not allow for optimistic outcomes. The crews knew this. They flew every night anyway. By August 1966, the 4th Air Commando Squadron had been forced to withdraw from operations over Laos after losing multiple aircraft to radar-guided anti-aircraft fire along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The North Vietnamese Army had positioned 37mm and 57mm anti-aircraft batteries with radar fire control along the route network. Against that level of coordinated air defense, the AC-47 had no answer. It could not fly fast enough to complicate the tracking solution. It could not fly high enough to get outside the effective range of the guns. When the environment was organized specifically to kill it, the Dragon died. 19 AC-47s were lost during the course of the war, 12 of them to combat. 86 crew members were killed. 86 men. The aircraft that carries the tail code EN086 at air shows today is not displaying a random number. It is displaying those 86 men by name in the only way an aircraft can carry names. The Commemorative Air Force's Gulf Coast Wing flies serial number 43-49297, the only confirmed airworthy AC-47. Spooky still flying anywhere in the world. EN-086. Every time it takes off, it takes those names with it. March 9, 1966. A Shao Special Forces camp, Thua Tien Province, northwestern South Vietnam, in a narrow valley close to the Laotian border, where the mountains came down on three sides and left almost no room for an aircraft to maneuver safely. The North Vietnamese Army had brought 2,000 regulars against the camp. Not Viet Cong irregulars. NVA regulars organized, equipped, and moving through the attack with the discipline of a conventional military force that had concluded the camp could be taken before dawn if the pressure was maintained. A 400-foot cloud ceiling forced every responding aircraft below the tops of the surrounding ridges. Spooky 70 serial number 44-76290 went in anyway. Pilot Captain Willard M. Collins. Co-pilot First Lieutenant Delbert R. Peterson. First pass. Collins brought the aircraft through the valley floor, and the miniguns opened up on the NVA formations, pressing against the camp perimeter. The enemy had not expected the Dragon to fly in weather and terrain like this. The attack on the wire faltered. The camp's defenders had a few minutes to consolidate their positions. Collins came around for the second pass. The NVA had been watching. They had identified the approach path the aircraft had to use in that valley with that ceiling. Multiple heavy machine gun positions coordinated and pre-sighted opened fire simultaneously. Both engines took hits. The power went away. The aircraft that had been holding up the sky for the camp below was now a falling machine with two dead engines and a crew that had seconds to make decisions. Collins put Spooky 70 down on a mountainside. The crash injured Staff Sergeant Robert E. Foster severely enough that he could not stand, could not walk, could not move under his own power at all. His legs were broken. A rescue helicopter was available. Collins and Peterson could have been extracted immediately. Both pilots were ambulatory. Both could reach the rescue aircraft. Both could be back at their base before the sun came up and the day shift started. They stayed. No regulation required it. No order had been given. Foster was a sergeant with two broken legs who was going to remain exactly where he was until someone carried him or the enemy reached him, and Collins and Peterson had looked at that situation and arrived at the same conclusion independently, and neither one of them had walked toward the helicopter. The enemy reached the crash site within 15 minutes. Collins and Foster were killed in the initial assault. Peterson, wounded, charged the machine gun position that was preventing the rescue helicopter from getting into the landing zone. He was working to cover the extraction of the surviving crew members, moving on his own through the wreckage of the aircraft, suppressing the position that had the clearest shot at the helicopter. He was seen last crawling behind the burned-out fuselage, still firing. His body was never recovered. Both Collins and Peterson received the Air Force Cross posthumously. It was the only occasion in Air Force history where both pilots of the same aircraft received the AFC for the same action. It was also the only AFC ever awarded for valor that encompassed both aerial combat and ground combat in a single engagement. The citation for Collins noted his decision to land the aircraft rather than attempt to bail out, which would have left Foster alone. The citation for Peterson noted his decision to charge the machine gun position rather than accept extraction while crew members remained pinned. The formal language of military citations is precise by necessity and constrained by convention. What it cannot fully capture is the simplicity of what these two men actually did. They looked at a situation, identified the person who could not help himself, and placed themselves between that person and the thing that was going to kill him. That is what happened at Ashao. That is what the Dragon sometimes cost. October 11, 1966. Quien Phong Province. A single Spooky defended a fortified position through a sustained night assault. It fired 43,500 rounds and dropped 96 flares before the ammunition was exhausted. The crew flew back to base, reloaded, and returned to the fight within 30 minutes. That engagement holds the single mission record for rounds expended in AC-47 combat history. By the end of 1967, Spooky gunships had flown more than 1,500 sorties, defending outposts across South Vietnam. The estimate of enemy killed ran to several thousand. 5 aircraft had been lost to ground fire and crashes during the year. The program that had been turned away at the runway in December 1964 was now flying 3 squadrons, more than 50 aircraft every night across the country. Captain Ronald W. Terry flew more than 200 combat missions in the AC-47 before his role in the program shifted. He received 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses. An institution that had once sent armed police to a runway to turn him away had recognized in the formal language of its highest awards that he had been right all along. The child he had built from a filing cabinet and his own credit card had grown into something he could no longer carry in 2 C-47s. It had become a program, a doctrine, a class of weapons that the Air Force would keep developing and flying and improving for decades after the war that had made it necessary was over. But the single greatest moment in the Dragon story had not happened yet. It would happen on the night of February 24, 1969, over Long Binh Army Post in the cargo bay of an AC-47 carrying the call sign Spooky 71. And the man who would create that moment was not a pilot. He was not a program manager or an institutional champion or anyone that the machinery of the Air Force had selected for a defining role. He was a 23-year-old loadmaster from Hartford, Connecticut, who was not even supposed to be on the aircraft that night. He had volunteered because the man who was supposed to fly had gotten sick, and someone needed to go. His name was John Levitow, and what he was about to do in the next 20 seconds would be talked about for as long as there is a United States Air Force to talk about it. John Lee Levitow was born on November 1, 1945 in Hartford, Connecticut, the capital city of the smallest state in the continental United States, in the final months of a war that his country had just finished winning. He grew up in Glastonbury, a town in the Connecticut River Valley southeast of Hartford, where the streets run past colonial-era farmhouses and the rhythm of the school year, and the church calendar still organized the life of the community in ways that the post-war decade had not yet fully dissolved. A place where a young man growing up in the early 1960s would have known the names of the men from his town who had served in the war that ended the year he was born, and would have grown up inside a particular American understanding of what service meant and what it asked of the men who provided it. He had planned to join the Navy. He changed his mind and enlisted in the Air Force in June 1966. His first assignment was civil engineering, the maintenance and infrastructure work that keeps a military base functional, but that appears in no one's idea of how a military career begins. Not special operations, not flight crew, not anything that would suggest a trajectory toward the kind of night that was coming. He cross-trained into the loadmaster career field. The loadmaster on a military transport or gunship aircraft is responsible for cargo weight and balance equipment accountability, and on a gunship specifically for the precise and reliable handling of the munitions that the aircraft exists to deliver. The flares that illuminate the battlefield, the ammunition that feeds the guns, the sequential timing of what goes out the door and when. It is work that requires methodical precision, spatial intelligence, and the ability to perform critical tasks accurately under conditions of extreme stress and noise and physical danger. In July 1968, Levitow was assigned to the 3rd Special Operations Squadron at Nha Trang Air Base, South Vietnam. He began flying combat missions on the AC-47 Spooky. Night after night, the circling aircraft, the roar of the guns, the rivers of red fire bending down from 3,000 feet to the jungle below. The radio traffic from the positions the Dragon was keeping alive. By February 1969, he had 180 combat sorties. 100 was the standard threshold for completing a combat tour in that era. 100 was what the Air Force asked of its combat crew members, the number that entitled a man to rotation home, and the acknowledgement that he had done what was required. Levitow had done it at 100. He had continued flying. At 150, he was still flying. At 180, he was still flying. Still showing up for the scheduling board, still putting his name on the list for the missions that needed crewing. 180 was not standard. 180 was the product of a man who had looked at the work and decided that the number on the scheduling board was not the same thing as the work being finished. On the evening of February 24, 1969, Levitow was not the scheduled loadmaster for Spooky 71. The man whose name was on the board for that night's mission had gotten sick. The slot needed to be filled. Someone needed to take the flight. Levitow said he would go. No one ordered him. No one called him and explained that the squadron needed him specifically, or that the mission was particularly important, or that there was any reason beyond the ordinary operational necessity of a slot that required a loadmaster and a loadmaster who was available and willing. He simply said he would take it. The man with 180 combat sorties who had already completed his tour twice over by the standard measure volunteered for sortie 181 because someone else could not fly it and the aircraft needed to go. That decision made in the ordinary way that a professional makes a professional decision is the foundation of everything that comes next. The crew of Spooky 71 for the night of February 24th, 1969 assembled at Bien Hoa Air Base in the hours before midnight. Major Kenneth Carpenter was the aircraft commander. He was the man who would hold a perforated and partially destroyed aircraft in controlled flight through the minutes that followed the explosion, through the violent bank angles and the structural uncertainty, keeping the aircraft in the air by skill and will and the particular quality of concentration that comes to a pilot who understands that the men behind him are depending on him to maintain the platform they are working on. Chief Warrant Officer William Platt was the navigator. After the mortar round hit, Platt would describe what the interior of the aircraft looked like in the first seconds. He would say it was lit up like daylight. He was referring to 3,500 individual holes in the fuselage skin, each one letting through a thread of the night sky outside the cumulative effect of that much shrapnel passing through an aluminum airframe at once. Airman. First Class Ellis Owen was the gunner. He was the man holding the armed flare when the world changed. Sergeant Edward Fusey and the other cargo compartment crew members rounded out the team that would be in the back of the aircraft when the mortar round arrived. And John Levito, loadmaster, sortie 181. Not his flight, the man who said he would go. The mission that night was direct fire support for Long Binh Army Post 3rd Corps area, approximately 15 miles northeast of Saigon. It was the kind of mission Spooky 71 had flown dozens of times before. The aircraft took off, flew to the assigned position, entered the pylon turn, and began firing in support of the ground forces below. Flares going out the door on schedule. Guns firing. The river of red light bending down through the night toward the positions the ground commander needed suppressed. Nothing about the mission in its first 23 minutes was different from any other night. 23 minutes past midnight. February 25th, 1969. Spooky 71 was in a steady left pylon turn at 3,000 feet guns, firing mission proceeding on schedule. Levito had just finished arming a Mark 24 magnesium illumination flare and passed it to Owen. Owen held it with standard procedure, his left hand gripping the body of the flare and his right finger looped through the safety pin ring. The pin that once pulled would start the fuse sequence that would ignite the flare approximately 100 feet after it left the aircraft. Owen was at the cargo door. The flare was ready. He was waiting for the correct point in the orbit to deploy it. An NVA 82mm mortar round struck the right wing of Spooky 71. 82 millimeters. Just over 3 inches in diameter at the base. A standard infantry weapon available in quantity, requiring no special training to operate at effective range. One round among the thousands that had been fired at American aircraft over Vietnam, and it found the wing. The explosion detonated inside the wing structure and blew a hole 2 feet in diameter through the aluminum skin. The force of the detonation drove more than 3,500 individual shrapnel fragments through the fuselage of the aircraft. Not into one side of the fuselage. Through it, entering from the right, passing across the cargo compartment, exiting through the left. 3,500 separate projectiles crossing the interior of the aircraft in the same fraction of a second, each one occupying its own trajectory through the space where the crew was standing. Platt forward in the cockpit would describe what he saw in the first instant. The interior of the aircraft was lit up like daylight. He meant it precisely. 3,500 holes in the skin of the aircraft, and outside every one of those holes was the night sky over Vietnam. And the cumulative light from 3,500 points of Vietnamese night sky passing through the aluminum shell of the aircraft simultaneously produced something that a man describing it later would call daylight. That is how many holes were in the aircraft. All 5 men in the cargo compartment were thrown to the deck by the blast wave. Carpenter and Platt forward in the cockpit were shielded from the worst of the concussion by the aircraft structure, but the aircraft they were flying had just changed into something that neither of them had ever tried to fly before. The armed flare was torn from Owen's hands. When it left his grip, his finger still looped through the safety pin ring, pulled the pin free. The fuse activated. The armed Mark 24 magnesium flare was now rolling loose on the cargo deck of Spooky 71. Surrounding it on all sides were the ammunition cans carrying 19,000 rounds of live 7.62mm ammunition for the miniguns. The Mark 24 flare burns at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit when it ignites. At 4,000 degrees, it will burn through the aluminum floor of the aircraft. It will reach the ammunition. 19,000 rounds of live 7.62 detonating inside a perforated, partially disabled aircraft at 3,000 feet over South Vietnam will destroy the aircraft and everyone aboard it. The fuse on the Mark 24, once activated, allows approximately 20 seconds before ignition. The clock was running. John Levitow was on the cargo deck with more than 40 shrapnel wounds in his back and his legs. The shrapnel had entered from the right side of the aircraft and passed through him the way it had passed through everything else in the cargo compartment. 40 individual fragments. Some of them were still in him. His right leg had partial loss of sensation. He was bleeding from more wounds than most men receive in a lifetime of combat. The aircraft was in a steep, uncontrolled bank shuddering through 3,500 structural perforations partially out of control as Carpenter worked from the cockpit to find what still responded. Levitow stood up. The first thing he did was not reach for the flare. The first thing he did was look at the cargo door and find Owen there, lying at the edge of the steep bank angle of the aircraft, and the violence of the structural damage pushing him toward the opening. Owen could have gone through that door at any moment in the next few seconds. Levitow grabbed him and pulled him away from the edge. Then he saw the flare. It was rolling along the aisle in a trail of smoke. The bank angle of the aircraft was working against everything Levitow needed the situation to be. Instead of rolling toward the open cargo door, the flare was rolling back along the deck in the direction of the ammunition cans that lined the cargo compartment walls. The geometry of the aircraft's turn and the steep bank angle created a slope that ran the wrong way, and the armed flare was following that slope. Levitow moved toward it. His right leg was not fully functional. He was bleeding. The deck was not level. The aircraft was shuddering. Every surface he reached for to steady himself was perforated or unstable. He moved toward the flare anyway. He could not grab it with his hands. It was moving too fast, and the angle of the deck and the oscillation of the aircraft made it impossible to time a grip on something rolling away from him. There was no technique available. There was no training scenario that had covered this. There was no procedure in the Loadmaster's manual that addressed what to do when an armed magnesium flare with an active fuse is rolling among 19,000 rounds of live ammunition in a perforated aircraft that is partially out of control. He threw himself onto it. He put his body on the flare and pulled it against his chest and held it the way a man holds something he is not going to let go of. He began to crawl toward the cargo door, against the bank angle that was trying to roll him backward toward the ammunition, with more than 40 shrapnel wounds, with partial sensation in his right leg, with an armed flare at over 4,000 degrees of potential heat pressed against his chest. With however many seconds remained on a fuse that was not designed to be held by a man crawling across the deck of a damaged aircraft. He kept crawling. The aircraft shuddered. The bank angle shifted. The slope of the deck changed and then changed back. Every change was working against him in a different way, and none of it stopped him, and he kept moving toward the door. He reached the cargo door. He threw the flare out into the night. At the instant the Mark 24 cleared the aircraft, the fuse completed its sequence and the flare separated and ignited. Outside the aircraft, 2 million candle power of magnesium ignition burning at over 4,000 degrees bloomed in the dark sky. 3,000 feet over South Vietnam. From the ground below, it would have looked like a piece of the sun falling slowly on a parachute. From inside the aircraft through 3,500 holes in the skin, it would have looked like a very bright light going away. Carpenter regained control of Spooky 71. He held the aircraft together through everything that the next several minutes required of it, and of him, and he flew it back to Bien Hoa Air Base, and he landed it. The aircraft was on the ground. The crew was alive, all of them. Levitow was evacuated with more than 40 shrapnel wounds and treated at a medical facility. He recovered. He went back to Vietnam. He flew 20 more combat sorties before his second tour was complete. In the light of the following morning, Major Kenneth Carpenter walked through the cargo compartment of Spooky 71. He was looking at the path Levitow had taken. The shrapnel entry points, the blood on the deck marking the places Levitow had been, and the direction he had moved. The distance from where the flare had been rolling to the cargo door it went through, the bank angle the aircraft had been in. The deck angle that would have been working against anyone trying to move in the direction Levitou moved with any load in any condition without injuries. Carpenter had been a pilot long enough to understand aircraft geometry and human mechanics. He had been in that cockpit during the 20 seconds. He had felt the bank angle and the structural damage, and he had been working with everything he had just to hold the aircraft in the air. He understood what the conditions in the cargo compartment had been. He made a statement afterward that has been quoted in every account of what happened on Spooky 71 that night. He did not embellish it. He did not reach for dramatic language. He said what he knew. I will never know how Levitou managed to get to that flare and throw it out. In my experience, I have never seen such a courageous act performed under such adverse conditions. That is the testimony of the man who was at the controls. The man who felt every degree of bank angle that Levitou was crawling against. The man who, when he tried to reconstruct what Levitou had done in that cargo compartment, said he would never know how it was accomplished. He did not say he was surprised by the courage. He said he would never understand how the physical act was completed. That is a different statement. It is the statement of someone who has done the geometry and found that the geometry does not fully explain the result. May 14, 1970. Armed Forces Day. The White House, Washington, D.C. President Richard Nixon presided over a ceremony honoring 12 recipients of the Medal of Honor, 5 from the Army, 3 from the Navy, 2 Marines, 2 from the Air Force. When it came to the Air Force recipients, one of them stood in a category that had never been occupied before. John Lee Levitou was the first enlisted member of the United States Air Force ever to receive the Medal of Honor. Not the first this year, not the first of the Vietnam era, not the first in a particular category or for a particular type of action, the first. In the complete history of the Air Force as a separate branch of the American Armed Services, from its establishment in 1947 to the moment Nixon placed the medal around Levitou's neck in 1970, no enlisted Air Force member had received the nation's highest award for valor. Of 14 Air Force recipients of the Medal of Honor at the time of that ceremony, 13 had been officers. Levitou was the first who was not. He had been an airman, first class at the time of the action. He was a sergeant by the time of the ceremony. He was 24 years old. The citation read in part from the official language Sergeant Levitou's gallantry. His profound concern for his fellow men at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Air Force and reflect great credit upon himself and the United States Armed Forces. The language is formal and precise in the way that official language is required to be, and it is insufficient in the way that official language is always insufficient when it attempts to describe what a human being actually did in a moment that does not fit inside institutional categories. The citation does not capture the geometry. It does not describe the bank angle or the number of shrapnel wounds or the rolling direction of the flare or the slope of the deck or the weight of 19,000 rounds of live ammunition stacked along the walls of the space Levitou was crawling through. It does not say that the man could not feel his right leg properly, or that he threw himself onto the flare because he could not stop it with his hands. Citations are documents. Documents record what can be recorded. What Levitou did in those 20 seconds is the kind of thing that exists in the memories of the men who were present, and in the geometry of the cargo compartment, and in the fact that they all came home. That is enough. It has always been enough. John Levitou left the Air Force in 1974 and went home to Connecticut. He did not become a celebrity. He did not leverage the Medal of Honor into speaking fees or commercial opportunities, or the kind of public recognition that American culture is generally willing to offer men whose extraordinary acts have been officially documented. He did not appear on television to represent the veteran's perspective. He did not trade on what had happened in the cargo bay of Spooky 71 for any personal advantage of any kind that has ever been recorded. He went to work for veterans, 22 years in veterans service and advocacy, congressional liaison for the Federal Department of Veterans Affairs in Connecticut, Chief of Medical Administration at the Newington 5VA Medical Center, Director of Planning for the Connecticut Department of Veterans Affairs, Senior Assistant to the Commissioner. The man who had thrown himself onto a burning flare to save the lives of 8 crew members spent the 2 decades after the war, making sure that veterans in Connecticut could access their medical care, get their disability claims processed, receive the benefits that the government had promised them. The machinery of veterans services is unglamorous, and it moves slowly, and the people who work inside it spend their careers fighting the same institutional inertia that Ronald Terry fought in a different context 20 years before. Levitou did it for 22 years. He was not famous in Connecticut, not in the way that the Medal of Honor might have made him famous if he had wanted that. People who passed him on the street in Glastonbury did not know what he had done. When they learned, he did not elaborate. He did not tell the story. He did not describe the bank angle or the rolling flare or the 20 seconds. He had done something that the country had formally recognized as extraordinary, and he had chosen to use the years afterward in service to the people around him, and he did not apparently require that anyone know why. That is the man who volunteered for Sortie 181. That is the man who said he would go because someone needed to go. John Levitou died on November 8, 2000. He was 54 years old. He had been fighting cancer for some time, and he lost, and he was gone. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery on November 17, 2000. Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force Jim Finch spoke about him at the time of his death. John Levitou for years has been woven into the fabric of our enlisted heritage. Through his heroic efforts, he was the embodiment of our core value service before self. His name has become synonymous with excellence. That last sentence is not metaphorical. The John Levitou Award is the highest honor presented to a graduate of Air Force enlisted professional military education. Every course level, every graduation ceremony at every base in every year since the award was established. The top graduate of each class receives it. When the award is presented, Levitou's name is read aloud. The story is told. The 20 seconds are described. More than 19,000 senior non-commissioned officers have graduated from the Senior NCO Academy alone since the award was established. Each of them heard the name. Each of them heard what happened on Spooky 71 on the night of February 24, 1969. Each of them went back to the Air Force that trained them, carrying that name and that story into the units they led. On January 31, 1998, a C-17 Globemaster, 3 serial number 96-0005, was christened the Spirit of Sergeant John L. Levitou at a naming ceremony. Levitou attended. He watched a 72-ton strategic airlifter bear his name. He had lived long enough to see a machine built 3 decades after the war. He flew in carry, forward the meaning of what he had done in it. He died 2 years later. The aircraft still flies. August 23, 1968. WWII CADG Camp, Central Highlands, South Vietnam. The NVA 6th Regiment inside the wire. The operations center burning. 40 defenders in a concrete blockhouse. The radios transmitting into silence. The ammunition running out. And then the sound. The low, heavy, unmistakable drone of twin radial engines turning slowly somewhere above the smoke. A machine designed in the 1930s, built in 1943, flying in 1968, over a jungle that had owned the night for years before anyone found a way to fight back in it. Over several days at WWII AC-47, spooky gunships fired 761,044 rounds in defense of that camp. 1,162 flares dropped. The camp held. The NVA 6th Regiment did not take WWII. 761,000 rounds. The concept that Fred Nelson proved on a biplane in Texas in 1926 and that the Army told him had no tactical application. The concept that Gilmore MacDonald proposed to the Navy in 1942 and received no response. The concept that John Simons documented in film in 1961 and that went into a filing cabinet for 3 years. The concept that Ronald Terry found in that filing cabinet and paid to advance because he had watched a Hamlet fall from 3,000 feet and could not accept that as an inevitable outcome. 761,000 rounds at WWII, delivered from aircraft that the armed police at Bien Hoa in December 1964 had orders to send home. 19 AC-47s were lost in the war, 12 to combat. 86 men who flew those aircraft never came home. Their names are on a plaque at Herbert Field Air Park, installed on September 9, 2016, at a ceremony attended by more than 100 air commandos who had served in the Spooky program. The tail code EN-086 on the last airworthy Spooky flying today is the number of those men rendered permanent, and the legend that the program built night by night from the first engagement at Tran Yen to the last Spooky mission in 1969 has never been formally contradicted. No outpost under Spooky's protection was ever overrun. Decades after the war ended, A woman wrote to the Spooky Brotherhood, the association of the men who had served in the AC-47 program. She had been a service club employee with the 3rd Brigade 101st Airborne Division at Phuoc Vinh in 1968. She had been a young American woman who had gone to Vietnam to support the men who were fighting it, and one night the enemy had come through the motor pool, and someone had handed her a pistol, and she had understood for the first time what the word dangerous actually meant when applied to the place she was in. Then Puff showed up, and she wrote what she remembered about that. It was the most beautiful sight I have ever seen in my life. All those red tracers in the night. I dearly love all you spooky guys, even though we never knew who you were. Thank you. Thank you. She never knew the crews. They never knew her. The men in those circling aircraft never saw the faces of the people they were keeping alive through the long hours between midnight and dawn. They never heard the relief in a voice when the radio confirmed that Spooky was on station. They never knew how many times the sight of that river of red fire in the darkness, descending from an old aircraft with radial engines that belonged to a war fought 20 years before theirs, meant that the next morning was going to happen. That is the nature of the kind of courage that circled at 3,000 feet in the dark over South Vietnam for 5 years. It is performed in the dark. It is performed for people the performer will never meet. It is performed without the knowledge of how it is being received or whether the person looking up from below is still alive to see it. Ronald Terry paid for it himself before anyone in his institution would pay for it. John Levital volunteered for the 181st time because someone else could not go. 86 men flew into the dark and did not come back. And the dragon they built and flew and died in kept its word from the first night at Tran Yen to the last mission in 1969 and through every generation of aircraft that descended from it. No outpost it defended ever fell. The dragon kept its promise.